Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
He'll be discussing his article today in Queer Dharma 2, which is entitled From India to Africa to Buddha, Weaving a Path Home. So welcome. And I'm going to move this over for you.
Thanks for inviting me to be here. I've been a member of GBF for a few years now, maybe 3-4 years, and one of the reasons I wrote this article is really it's an opportunity for me to reflect on my own spiritual journey and see if I can, at least for a moment, crystallize a little bit of what I've learned and what I've experienced in my process of awakening and following a path. And what I'd like to do is to read a few pieces, a few chunks of the article and allow you to make comments or ask questions anywhere through the talk. So just feel free to do that anytime you want. Some of the main themes in the chapter are my process of migration, my family's process of migration from India to Africa, and then here, and how those experiences of loss and fragmentation and reintegration and the cultural pieces around that have informed and somewhat set a stage for my own spiritual process. And another piece is the process of coming out and struggling with my sexuality, and sort of the split between the ascetic, monk-like part of me and the more relationship-oriented gay part of me, and how those were split for a while and I couldn't integrate them in my process of that integration. And sort of the gradual movement of becoming what I'm calling sort of a gay yogi. And what does that mean? And then there's also stories of homoeroticism in India from my travels there, of what I learned and what I experienced and so on. And the role of teachers and mentors. So we'll just touch on a few of these and just allow sort of the organic process to take us, or the Dharma to inform where we go with this. So I'd like to start with sort of the perspective with which I wrote this. Knowing ourselves about 10% of the time seems about as close as most of us get, and perhaps that's enough. I read in a book that 10%, like the minute specks of pollen that cling to a bee's wings, can beautify and nourish the world if we dare risk it. In the East, a bee is a symbol of a mind focused on truth and beauty. In that seeking from various teachers in the form of practices, books, relationships, Dharma talks, therapy, and the silent voice within, each one of us has collected our own unique blend of pollen. This writing is perhaps my 10%, my risk, a mirror for others and myself of this inner journey within a Buddhist context. From my personal and professional experience, it appears that most of us are called to find meaning and begin a spiritual quest after certain critical experiences of suffering. For some, the suffering is a constant ache for something more, what is referred to as dukkha in Buddhism. A sense that something is off, not quite right in our lives. For others, this dukkha is riveted by some significant death or loss. For people with a different sexual orientation than the norm, the common experience of being an outcast, as well as facing familial and cultural homophobia while coming out, can surface this experience of dukkha. The AIDS epidemic has also catapulted many individuals and perhaps the gay community into the impermanence of physical life. In the fall of 1972, I was walking home from elementary school in the capital of Uganda, East Africa. Uganda is a small country next to Kenya, then known for its rich mineral water and coffee plantations drenched with rain and equatorial sun. It was populated by native Africans, East Indians, other Asians, and a few Europeans, mainly from Britain. It was a haven for those seeking to explore East African wildlife, begin a new life in a developing country with open opportunities, or exploit the natural resources and cheap labor abundant at the time. In the early 1900s, given the stagnant Indian economy and the stratified class structures, many Indians left northwestern India and sailed southwest across the warm Indian Ocean to East Africa. They often docked in small ports of Kenya and began their trek with a native African guide across the jungles. My grandfather was one of those adventurous souls who brought his family, which included my father, from India to begin a new life in East Africa. Consequently, I was born in Uganda. I remained a Ugandan citizen until the fall of 1972, when Idi Amin, a ruthless dictator, declared that people of all races except the native Africans to be exiled out of the country within 90 days. From that day onwards, we were stateless. Our passports were taken away. Controls were put in all commerce. There was tremendous looting and the beginning of kidnapping and killing. Much of this I saw as a young boy on the streets of Kampala, the capital. A warm, peaceful town with papaya trees, mango groves, and sugarcane fields turned into a militant war zone overnight. In short, we were warned, detach or die. This was the ultimate Buddhist practice, one the Tibetans know all too well. Within weeks, our extended family and community would be scattered across the globe. The words of the Buddha in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra provide counsel in confronting our attachments to everything we think we are and possess. He said, "What is born will die. What has been gathered will be dispersed. What has been accumulated will be exhausted. What has been built up will collapse. And what has been high will be brought low." We gave everything away, said goodbye, drove off our driveway, and flew off the continent on East African Airlines. All of this in about 60 days. Fragmentation often precedes wholeness. As the Buddha so poignantly described, death is followed by rebirth, a rebirth of another order. The old consciousness must die since it cannot comprehend the emerging consciousness, one that is perhaps closer to Buddha nature. Honoring and becoming skillful at allowing things to crumble when it's time, and then being present for the rebirth is a central theme in spiritual life. In the words of Jack Kornfield, when we finally look at horror and joy, birth and death, gain and loss, with an equal heart and open mind, there arises a most beautiful and profound equanimity. So I'd like to sort of take a breath there and said a lot and sort of let anybody who wants to say anything or ask anything do so. Yeah, Rolf.
First of all, I want to ask you one thing is, when you raised as a Buddhist, when your grandparents moved from India to or was it Hindu?
No, I was raised in sort of a tradition that comes out of northwestern India, which is a combination of Hinduism and Sufism. My great-grandparents were Hindus, and then there was an influence from the Persian culture of the various Sufi teachers, and so it's sort of a mixture of the two. Yeah.
I was in Uganda myself.
Oh.
Actually, I flew from Denmark to Kenya, and we went down to an Egyptian airline, and we went down to Uganda, got stuck there. Exactly at that time when that dictator was there, the horror of his whole regime.
So this was in the early 70s that you were there. Yeah.
It was, actually it was later. It was later in the 70s. And I remember we couldn't leave the airport. We got stuck for 7 hours, and we couldn't leave the airport.
Yeah.
Well, I already knew about this man. Tremendous.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah. And what's sad is the people who suffer the most are the native Africans, who he was trying to protect or care for, or So it's interesting how it turned out.
Was there a general? I'm getting into the secular lens. I'm curious. Was there a general collapse of the Ugandan economy after all these non-natives were immigrated out?
Yeah, because the infrastructure was really held up by the Asians and the Indians and the British. That's were holding up the infrastructure, and that really collapsed. So the country had a lot of serious problems economically and so on, and it's come back the last 3 or 4 years.
Did you yourself feel deeply connected to the country itself? After all, you came from a subculture which had its own dynamics and its own support system, which is a little different from the country itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question, because in some ways I don't think I really felt connected to it at that level, where even though I was born there and it was home, I still don't feel like my roots were really there. And when I went to India, I felt much more connected to India and the culture there. And we weren't really integrated with the African culture that much. Just like you said, there was a subculture. Although my parents seemed to feel really connected to East Africa for some reason. It's really interesting. So it's this whole thing of sort of weaving a path home. Part of the title is there isn't a sense in me of really feeling rooted in any culture, or any country, even though I'm a U.S. citizen and have lived here much of my life. So the stage is set for finding home somewhere else,
Is Idi Amin still alive?
Yeah, I think he is. The last I heard, he was with his... where's Gaddafi? Libya. I think he sort of found his match, found his soulmate in Libya, and he's kind of hanging out there. Yeah.
What about, you said you didn't feel attached to Uganda. Did you feel attached or integrated with your family?
Yeah, I think so. We were very close. We still are in some ways. Indian families, there's a strong maternal component. My mother is very maternal. There's a strong connection to the feminine, and for boys and girls. And, we went through a lot. We were refugees, and we were in hostels and all kinds of stuff. So there was a lot of pulling together in the family, and so I did feel that, yeah.
A second ago you mentioned this sense of not identifying with any one particular country. Mm-hmm. Would you extend that to a particular culture, or is that a bit of a stretch?
Yeah, I feel like, my ego and my body and a good part of my sort of conscious life is here in the West. This is where I live. But I feel like my soul really lives in India. It's really funny, when I went there, I really touched into that. So I think at heart, that's the culture I really feel most connected to and feel in some ways at home. And have sort of some desire, maybe at some point, to spend a few years there if I can, maybe at some point in my life, and reconnect with that whole part of myself and my roots.
What's the Indian approach to a gay man?
It's a very mixed approach. On one level, there's a tremendous amount of homoeroticism. Indian men have a tremendous connection to the feminine, to the feeling world, to the inner world, and to other men. So on one level, there's a lot of relatedness and connection and eroticism, but homosexuality and being gay openly and living the lifestyle there's a lot of oppression and prejudice there. So there's very few people actually coming out and living it out. it's experienced more in a hidden sort of a way. So there is an acceptance of that.
You may not know this. There was an article written in a book, I think it's called Same-Sex Action or something, by a psychologist named Robert Johnson.
Yeah.
And the very first selection, which I've actually read many times, was his experiences in India, which struck me so deeply, so profoundly that I wanted to read it over and over again, was his experience of connectedness between men in India, but not restricted to India. That in some ways was powerfully erotic, but wasn't erotic in the way we conceptualize erotic, where we focus it so much on more genital connection.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if that was at all your experience, or if you've ever had that kind of experience?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's very synchronistic that you're mentioning Robert Johnson, because I've quoted Robert Johnson in here. And Robert Johnson happens to be one of my teachers and one of my mentors. And the trip I did take to India was with Robert. So that was definitely my experience, very much so. And I had those kinds of connections where there's a deep relatedness and a connection with the other men then. So it's clearly erotic, but erotic doesn't have to be sexual, and sexual is not always erotic. And I think the roots of eroticism is, I think, union. I think it really means union, or to bring together. So yes, very much so, in a very profound way, where there would be deep eye contact and a deep sort of a connection with some of the men there, or just a holding of hands that was very profound and much more fulfilling at the emotional, spiritual sort of level, and yet very, very erotic, very sensual and physical. Yeah. So let me read that portion, since we're right there. One of my mentors and dear friend for about 10 years is Robert Johnson, the Jungian analyst and author of several books, including He, She, and Inner Work. When I did my roots trip to India in 1996, I spent about 10 days with Robert in Pondicherry, South India. He has been journeying through South India for about 17 years and knows it like the back of his hand. We had ample time sitting at small Indian cafes, drinking chai and sharing experiences, observations, and questions, while I was enjoying the procession of beautiful men draped in their traditional colorful shawls and flowing Indian lungis and dhotis, elegantly wrapped around their waists. On one of those mornings, Robert told me a beautiful story about same-sex intimacy between men in India, which he also writes about. He shared, "One day I was riding my bicycle, minding my own business, although nothing is ever entirely one's own business in India, when a young fellow came along paralleling me. In good Anglo-Saxon style, I moved over slightly and dutifully looked straight ahead. The young fellow remained parallel to me, so I moved over a little farther, but he was still there. Presently he reached out, took my hand, and we proceeded for a block, riding together hand in hand. He turned off at the next street, and I never saw him again. But feeling was exchanged, and a bond was made. That is the genius of India." What this made clear to me as an American is that one of the great barriers to us with our Western mind of understanding is that some of the forms of love which are not common to us, we tend to sexualize. And we ascribe sexuality to things which aren't necessarily attached to that part of our nature. I am in no way diminishing sexuality, but it's not everything. To ride a bicycle holding hands with a stranger, this is the homoerotic world. It is affection, devotion, one of the 96 kinds of love described in Sanskrit, which we often cannot comprehend. Not a nice story. Yeah.
I want to follow up on your opening. You said 10%. I'd just like to know what those 10% and the rest of the 90 is. And second thing is that you mentioned kind of monastic life comparing to a social life in the gay world, which is something I have dealt with in my own way of thinking, that I do see myself sometimes in a monastic situation. At the same time, I do have the need of compassion and companionship with gay people. You do that a little bit on that.
Well, that's something that I personally struggled with because I started out my spiritual practice with the yoga tradition. And there was sort of a bias in that tradition, a lot of the teachers, where really the monastic tradition is the highest form of spiritual life. And if you can't do monasticism well, then you can become a householder and preferably heterosexual, And I was at an age where my conditioning really fit that, So it was really in my therapy and in the process of getting in touch with the needs of my body and my emotional needs that I began to have spiritual experiences that were just as valuable, just as deep, just as transformational, holding somebody and being intimate with somebody as I did in meditation, And meditation was transcendental, and I reached altered states, but the other was much more nourishing in a body form, in an emotional form. Yeah. I was much more comfortable being here, being in my body. It was sort of the union of, the form and the formless, or heaven and earth, or, human and divine. So for me, there's less and less separation of, the ascetic and the ecstatic, if you will. That there's, that's two ways to look at it. The ascetic being the more monastic tradition of really going within and doing without and neti, and the ecstatic being more the tantric way, where everything is really divine. Everything is immersed with that energy, with that spirit. So I don't know if that kind of touches on some of that.
How is this spiritual life you have led, how does that inform or become intertwined with your professional life? And sounds like that is your profession as a therapist.
Yeah, definitely transpersonal. To me, they're totally connected because I see psychological work and spiritual work as really going hand in hand. For me, they're both really essential. That's why I feel like Jack Kornfield is really one of my teachers, because he almost makes no separation between the psychological and the spiritual. That when you work out something in your relationship or you work out stuff with your father, that's just as important as having a deep insight in meditation. So for me, I definitely bring both of those into my work, and I just find one just works off of the other. And I think people who have done a certain amount of spiritual work and meditation have a certain amount of presence and an ability to hold psychological material that's very, very uncomfortable. There is some place of witness that one can reside in so that you are not as identified and caught in the complex. And it's, I think, easier to work with.
It's a lay observation on my part. I do not have your background, but that I am dealing with some issues with some people in my life who have been in therapy for a good long period, actually. Kind of a traditional Western Freudian-based type of environment, and we're increasingly having difficulties relating. In fact, it's destroyed one friendship already, which in some ways has been a relief. In other ways, there's a certain amount of sadness around that. But I'm curious what your observation, if you also observe maybe kind of a bifurcation, if you will, behind or between a transpersonal approach and perhaps in the more traditional Western approaches, and what those implications might be?
Well, the Western approach is very ego-based. It is really focused on personality. And anything beyond that is either considered regression, psychosis, and really denial. So it's a very limited model. It's an important model because we do have personalities and we do have issues with our personalities. And sometimes spiritual teachers and spiritual technologies, if you will, cannot really address that directly, I find. I don't think they're sometimes suited to really address personality issues. And we live in a very wounded culture. I mean, we just do. That's the reality in maybe a wounded world where what's called there's pre-Oedipal wounding, narcissistic issues and borderline issues, and the whole familial matrix has really broken down in this culture. And India has its problems and other countries have its problems, but you find that the parenting is very, very central, and that children receive a tremendous amount of nurturing in indigenous cultures. So there's a level of intactness that really isn't here. I mean, that in the West, there's, I think, a lot more personality fragmentation, And then there comes a point, I think, where in development, and Ken Wilber talks about this, where there's a pre-personal and personal and then transpersonal, where the psychological schools, the Western psychological schools, don't really address higher development. They don't really understand altered states of consciousness, deep compassion, and the sense of emptiness or loss of soul that people feel, that no amount of therapy can really address. It's really a spiritual issue. I think that the linear model that Ken Wilber speaks about is not really how it happens. I think people touch very high states of consciousness, and then they have to return to dealing with father issues or mother issues or narcissistic issues. So I think it's a really back and forth kind of a process, more of a dialectical process versus a linear process. And
I don't read Wilber that way myself, but that's interesting.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So I really think it's a constantly, it's both and all the time. Both and. I think there's some very developed spiritual teachers who have major psychological problems. So. Yeah.
Curious about, in my own background, I've done a lot of sitting and meditating is very useful. I also, of course, have another tradition. I'm part of Jewish, and there's a lot of rituals that have actually turned out to be very important to me. And I'm thinking about right now in which a close friend of mine's father died last night. Died. And last night, as part of Jewish rituals, to sit shiva. I've done that with a lot of people. And it's interesting for me that the ritual, rather than the talking or anything else, enters a very deep part of me, which allows me to embrace parts of my own life that haven't necessarily been totally embraced in the particularities. So, for example, my own parents died, and of course that was a deep and powerful experience for me. But it didn't quite end with their death. In fact, it hasn't ended, it's 20 years, but it never has ended for me. And being involved in a particularly ritual sense opens up pieces of me that aren't actually accessible in other ways. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your own practice, or even the access you have to traditions that you were born into or exposed to, whether that's having a role.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. What you're bringing up. And Carl Jung actually spoke a lot about that, of returning to rituals and traditions that are part of your history and part of the collective of your lineage and your culture, and how we really reclaim parts of ourselves by doing that. And in some ways, he was opposed to Westerners, sort of what he called grafting Eastern spiritual practices, because the psyche is so different. The psyche is a Western Christian, Judeo-Christian sort of a psyche, and there's all these rituals that go along with that and symbols. And I mean, that was his bias, But for me personally, I guess I can respond with talking about just a short experience that I had when my grandmother died about a year ago. And she died in Vancouver, Canada, and she and I were very close for a long time. And she had sort of her ritual at a Sufi mosque over there. And there was a lot of chanting in both Hindi and Arabic throughout the whole process. And there wasn't a typical funeral where people talk about their experiences with her. None of that was done. It was all done with prayers and chanting, and her body was in the front of the hall. And people would just go up in silence and just sort of pay homage and sit back down. And I felt like it was really, really important for that ritual to happen in the way it did, because it really connected me to my roots. That another kind of service wouldn't have really done that. And I remember my brother and I sort of saying, gosh, we sort of miss this community. This is our community. These are our people. And it felt archetypal. It felt like I knew this. I'd done this before. This was my history. This was my heritage. So I'm constantly sort of, dealing with this all the time. These are all the various parts of me. And also sort of the Hindu part of me, because I connect so deeply with that culture also. And how to put all that together. Is it going to be a big mishmash of stuff? And, you don't really do anything well. You just sort of mix everything up. Or is there some sort of integration? Is there some sort of mandala that can come out of this? And again, I think it reminds me of Jack Kornfield, because he's very eclectic. And, he brings in Rumi and all kinds of stuff. So he continues to be a teacher for me in that way, because he's also now dealing with his Turkish Jewish roots, which is an interesting sort of unfoldment in his life, I'm sure. So, yeah. Yeah, David.
Yeah, I think it's very important to recognize the particular expertise or genius, as you say, of certain traditions. I don't think any one of the traditions covers the whole territory.
Yeah.
Whether you're speaking of psychological work or the Sufi training of the heart, to divine love, or the Buddhist grand view, of the cosmos. I think it's good to be open to whatever comes your way. I think we recognize we're Californians. This is like being at the center of the funnel. Everything's coming through here. And Native American influence.
Yeah.
The beautiful land we live in, the ocean. Elemental thing. Spiritual. It's very, very rich. So I don't think you need to worry about choosing. It's just something will come into your hand. I mean, Shakespeare's sonnets have recently come to my hand. Realizing, just the medicine I need. So.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really nice. So what about practice? Then do you, if Rumi or Shakespeare comes into your life, then do you then not practice? I don't know what your practice is, if you do insight meditation on a regular basis or not, because some people will say, well, you need some practice that you do on a regular basis. I mean, I think that's sort of the question that often comes up, to really go deep and to really deal with boredom and all of those issues that come up on the spiritual path. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's often something I work with or struggle with sometimes.
What is the struggle?
Well, sometimes
it's a struggle against thinking that you should have some kind of discipline that you follow.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
I was thinking about before when you said you talked about your grandmother's funeral.
Yeah.
I went back to Denmark 2 years ago, and I walked with a friend of mine. We had a picnic out in the forest, and certainly the whole concept of Denmark, when brought up, I lived in the United States for 20 years, came back in such a strong, powerful way that I really saw how much I belong there. But at the same time, it's a habit that was created from my childhood. So obviously, I'm not so sure. What I'm trying to say with all this is that I was rooted there, but it was because I was born there. Now, if I was born somewhere else, if I was born in Greenland, I probably would feel that about ice or whatever. But what I'm trying to say with all this is the gay community itself has been so painful. I mean, so many of us have so much pain involved with it that I find that it's difficult to let go of that pain and find my new way of life. Do you understand? As a gay person, as a free person. Because somewhere that habit of my upbringing of being still not the right person, I don't fit so well, I can still not say, I'm gay. You know, I can't walk into a classroom as an instructor and say, my name is Rob and I'm gay. You know, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I still think that there's a brainwash attitude for my gayness and my lack of being able to move into a spiritual way and see myself gay and spiritual at the same time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense what
Yeah,
I'm saying?
yeah.
I know it's a little confusing.
Yeah, it does. And I think that I can respond by that. I quoted somebody who's really working with this. His name is William Schindler. He's in Los Angeles, and he started an organization called Ashram West. And it's more of the yoga tradition, but it's Vedanta. He's working with Vedanta and the tantric approach, really. And he says something interesting that I think might speak to what you're talking about. It's helped me a lot. It's got a... if I can find it. Yeah, I'll have to. I'll get it at some point to you. Yeah.
I had a bit of a reflection of what Rolf said, and also something that you said, which is, on the idea of being, I'm a child of immigrants, German immigrants, who grew up with a Catholic and Christian Science tradition, and they didn't like either of them, and raised me in chaotic, and here I am, a Buddhist, and you grew up a Hindu with a Sufi influence, and here you are a Buddhist, and then what Rolf said about the fact that as gay men we haven't been welcomed in a lot of spiritual traditions, particularly in this country. And I think about that. My brother's a fundamentalist Christian, and periodically gets on tears where he wants to convert me, and
I have one of those too in my family. So,
and he asked me to accept Jesus for Christmas, and I told him I already did. Perhaps not quite in the way that he'd understand it. And I think of my own trip to India, which was very transformative, and I remember seeing in Hindu temples, hearing about the early Christian missionaries who came to India, and they would encounter people that said, Jesus is the Lord. And, oh yes, sure. And they put a crucifix, along there with Allah and Krishna.
Yeah.
And
the Hindus or something.
I don't know. I struggle with that a little bit, but I think it was Thich Nhat Hanh or Jack Kornfield who the idea of take the one seat. Just do one practice, find one thing. And I don't know, I struggle with that a little bit because as you were talking, I was having images of, what were the Christian burials like in my people, these grim Germans in black, marching to, what was that? So I'm a little incoherent. I guess the question or comment is how, queer you are and what you might have read about how to find a direction when you're raised in this cornucopia that can be so confusing, which I think is California.
Yeah. Well, I think David really spoke to that really well, really beautifully, and brought in the whole piece about the land and California and the Native American traditions and all of that. So in that sense, it's a tantric sort of approach. It really is all of that, and none of that, on some level, it's the self is still beyond that, or the no self is still beyond that. It's formless, it's emptiness, and enjoying that. I don't know if you want to say anything more. I felt like,
well, I sort of think if you find yourself, whirling into the cornucopia, you just let go. Mm-hmm. And you take what comes to hand. It's kind of like Alice, falling through the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
That's the times we're in.
Yeah.
I look at my life as being guided, by all the teachers and bodhisattvas. I take them to be quite real and interested in my life and others' lives.
Yeah.
And things that come along, and things that enter your life, can teach you.
Yeah.
And whether they're specific or whether there's something spooky about it, on that level, just whatever comes into your life, see how it interacts with you, and observe it very carefully. Just, develop your awareness. And that's the practice that's consistent through all of these changing practices. Awareness.
So that may be your one seat, David.
Yeah. Falling through the rabbit hole.
I love it. That's great. That'll be your next article, I think. Yeah, Clint.
I'd like to echo that. I've had a very telling experience of that recently. I just came back from a week in Mexico in a sunny resort town, Puerto Vallarta. And it's a very one-tone experience. And maybe there's all these subtleties and nuances that I wasn't picking up on after each day, but it's very Catholic. I think about 96% of the population is Catholic. And it's very laid back. All you do is just sit margaritas on the beach. And the expatriate community, I don't think there's a whole lot more than doing that. I mean, there's a strong expatriate movement community down there. And it's quite beautiful, and it's quite sunny and tropical. But I come back here, and it's just, like you say, it's like a kaleidoscope. I mean, there isn't like this one tone. It's like you're pulled in all these different directions.
Yeah.
And I was missing that down there. I mean, I could see the beauty of it. I was like, oh, see, this is not my tradition. This is not my home.
Yeah.
And I was very glad to be back, all rainy, damp, depressing.
That's why we need all the other things.
Eclecticism itself can be a tradition, and it can be kind of like being pulled in all different directions can be a tradition too. It's kind of like riding a surfboard where you pull this way, you pull that way, and you learn to negotiate that. And it's part of your tradition. You develop a skill for that for a while. And I bemoan the fact to myself that I feel scattered sometimes. I feel like I'm dabbling in all these different things rather than like just really getting to one thing solid and committing myself to that too. And I'm really wondering whether that's not such a terrible thing. That in itself can be an acceptable tradition, just to have all these different influencing forces and ideas and concepts and schools and so on, all converging on you all the time, and you have this tremendous eclecticism, and something that arises from it. It's quite different than if you were raised in a Southern Baptist town where all you did was do what your brother does, is have one fundamental tradition, and you're not exposed to anything else but that.
interesting.
Oh, we have time for one last question.
Okay.
It's not exactly a question. I'd like to respond to some pieces which Clint was just talking about now. And I was sort of amazed how these came together. I was struck earlier by the story you read about the procedure done with the bicycle holding hands. And what it reminded me of first was an experience that I had, which sort of puzzled me a couple of weeks ago as I was taking Bart to meet with my partner at his family's place for his mother's birthday in Fremont. I ended up connecting with this boy who was sitting across the way, who was a student at USF, and it was confusing for me because I was initially attracted to him. He was dozy. He woke up and sort of looked at each other, and eventually we started talking. And what was confusing was that it was a satisfying experience. I don't know whether he was gay or not. If he was paying attention, knew that I was, because I was talking about my partner and using male pronouns. And then we got to the station at the end of the line, and he left and I left. And I started the feeling he wanted to in some way continue a connection, and I didn't do that because I didn't quite know what to do. I'm in a monogamous relationship. But it also, that brought back echoes of earlier thoughts, which I think, I can't remember if I wrote about in my article in the first issue of Queer Dharma, of how I used to deal with sex. And it was very Western. It was goal-oriented. It was an objective. And at some point I realized the seed sort of not to quite compute, because I would spend this time, developing ego and appearance and personality and so forth, and dressing properly so I could go out and talk with somebody in a bar, so that I could suggest going home together, so that we could get home, so we could sit next to each other, so that I could touch them, so that they could touch me, so that we could get undressed, so that we could get to bed, so that we could do various things together, so that I would have a climax, and then I usually want them to go. And what struck me as fun about it was there were, depending on how you calculate it, certainly hours, and in a broader sense, days, weeks, or years, to get to this objective, which only lasted a few seconds. And
that's great.
What has struck me about the later part of this conversation, which actually I find connecting with that, because I thought about this is in a larger context of Western society, which is very goal-oriented. We do things for the future.
Yes, and to get somewhere. And
it seems to me that many traditional religions, including the more religious versions of Buddhism, it's about you learn the rules and you get fit into a mold, and then you eventually get there, and after that it's heaven and salvation. You die, and you've made it. St. Peter welcomes you at the gates. Good, I did it right. And what strikes me is that the fundamental perspectives of Buddhism is that there isn't any goal, there's just a path. It's just now. And so that fits, I believe, with what David and Clint were saying about taking our experience and our connections as that's it. It's not about molding ourselves into some, I'm supposed to be a Catholic, or I'm supposed to be a whatever, but it's just really that experience. And I think that connects with the sexual part. And finally, that seems to me to fit well with what we need to do as gay people, almost invariably growing up in heterosexual families, which don't have here's the mold, fit into it. So
it's interesting, yeah. So we're sort of, the stage has been set for us to be more open and not fit into even a spiritual mold. Yeah. Thank you. That's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, we need to end, so I'd like to just end with a short quote from a Buddhist teacher, because I think it's just sort of brings it back to the center. Is that? This is by Urgen Tulku Rinpoche, from Repeating the Words of the Buddha. When the heart is so overwhelmed with compassion, seeing the suffering of humanity, that the hairs on your arms stand on end and tears involuntarily flow down your cheeks, then you are in the natural state. And when you are so overwhelmed with devotion and love, seeing the beauty of all sentient beings, that the hairs on your arms stand on end, and tears involuntarily flow down your cheeks, then you are in the natural state. Thanks.
Do we have announcements? Perhaps starting Jack, our host.
Well, everybody, please stay for tea and coffee cake, and the remainder is some pretty Baroque birthday cake. On the table out there afterwards, but if you do have tea, wash your teacup. As we almost know after hearing that weekly for the past 2 years. And please contribute to the Dana Bowl, which helps to defray expenses of rent and other expenses that GBF has. There's a big sign so you don't miss what that is right next to it. Anybody new or who's not on the newsletter or who's been dropped off the newsletter, as I have, please put their name into the Dana Bowl. And I think you can do that on the list.
This is a sheet of paper.
I didn't find the sheet of paper when I was putting it out.
How would
Old napkins.
Scrap paper. Improvise. Then there's monthly potluck next week, but I don't know anything about that.
I'll be listening. It's next Saturday.
And it is at
my house.
Which is where?
Topaz Way in Diamond Heights. You know where the Safeway store is up there. It's just around the corner.
Is it in the newsletter?
I believe so.
Okay.
It's 26 Topaz. My phone number's there too, I believe.
And that's next Saturday night at 7.
Nice.
7 o'clock. There's usually a group of people that go out for lunch after tea and cookies today. And so please,
The Baroque birthday cake is for Larry. Larry's birthday last Friday. Maybe we can say happy birthday.
And the last thing is new cars. Oh, you want to sing? No, I'm sorry.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.